Well, hello. Welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast, where we talk with writers from all mediums and genres about themselves, their work, and advice they have for other writers. I'm your host, Paul Zeidman, and I'm quite thrilled today to be talking to my guest. Let us say hi to Aislinn Brophy. Aislinn, welcome to the Creative Writing Life podcast.
So happy to be here.
Oh, my pleasure. We're going to be talking about Aislinn's new book, Spells to Forget Us. I just read it over the weekend. Loved it. I can't wait to talk to her about it. But as regular viewers and listeners of the show are familiar, we like to start things off talking about things we may have read or watched lately. Did we like it? Did we hate it? Were we kind of about it? I'll go first just to give you a few moments to collect your thoughts. Like, what was it I watched this weekend? Because people do that. Um, After traveling last week, after we got home, my wife and we decided to have a mini, let's call it a mini horror comedy film festival. So first we watched Abigail, which I think is on, I want to say it's on Prime or Peacock. I can't remember, but we loved it. It was a lot of fun. I think they did a really good job with it. Probably could have been about maybe 10 minutes shorter, but for the most part, really enjoyed it. And I thought this was going to be more comedic, but it was not. It was more serious. It's called Late Night with the Devil, which was fantastic. It's about a late night host in the late 70s, and they decide to try and contact Satan on the air. And it's kind of like it's a great concept to begin with, and I thought they did a fantastic job in the execution, and the production design was spot on. Just really felt like they made it in like 1977. This one, I had heard, well, I heard mixed reviews about this, and I wanted to see it. My wife was kind of skeptical, so we started watching Lisa Frankenstein, and boy, was that bad. We got 20 minutes into it and just couldn't watch anymore. It was just not good. And the shocker of it, this was written by Diablo Cody, she won an
Oh.
Oscar for Juno, and she also did Jennifer's Body, which was another horror comedy. But this one was just disappointing. The writing was just, I mean, it probably could have done with at least, I'm going to say from the writing perspective, at least two more rewrites. But that's just me. I don't have an Oscar, so I can't. Diablo doesn't have to listen to me. I'm sure she's really concerned about that. Aislinn, what about you? What has been in your reading or viewing queue?
Oh, that makes me sad to hear about Lisa Frankenstein. I really wanted to watch that.
Well, maybe you
I've
can
heard,
still enjoy it.
well, I think that, truly to me, I am not always horribly bothered by a movie being bad. Sometimes I'm like, I really like this thing about it, or like this, performance. Sometimes if the script is ludicrous, I can't get on board, but
Sure,
sometimes,
sure.
sometimes it can still work for me. I did watch Twisters this last weekend. And I thought the special effects were really cool. That's my take from that movie, was that I was shocked by the amount of twisters that were in that movie. I
Hmm.
think that there was a certain point where it left being like an action type movie for me and moved directly into like almost like fantasy. I was like, if there are this many tornadoes here, I I would have evacuated. I would have evacuated the whole state. If we're hitting a tornado every 20 minutes in this movie, by the fifth tornado, I was like, God, why does anyone live here? Why are people surprised when these tornadoes are hitting them? If this has been how it's like, I was like, no one lives here anymore. It was a thoroughly enjoyable movie. I did feel it was very silly, but I think that that is what it was trying to do anyway. And then what else did I read recently? Oh, I read If Tomorrow Doesn't Come by Jen St. Jude. Oh my God, that book was incredible. Totally completely different from Twisters. Uh
No
yeah, it's
tornadoes in that one?
no tornadoes in this book. Yeah, it's very sad. I tend to be really critical about young adult contemporary. I don't write young
Mhm.
adult contemporary, and I'm also not a teen. I don't know if you knew that. But I do end up reading them and being like, this feels exactly right for someone who's 15, and that is what it should be. So sometimes it's very hard for me to find things that cross over for me as an adult right now. I don't feel like that about fantasy, which is why I write young adult fantasy, but sometimes contemporary, I could be like, you should be writing about this. And also, I don't know if it's for me, but this one was so good. It has this main character who has undiagnosed clinical depression, and the book opens with her planning to end her life. And then she gets a call that when she's about to do that, telling her that there's apparently this like asteroid heading for Earth and that the world is going to end in 9 days. So it's kind of lightly speculative, I guess, because it's an end of the world book. But it just was so beautiful. I think I really cried for the last third of the book, which is wild
Wow.
for me. Yeah, I was sitting there being like, it's about finding meaning at the end of the world and being able to reconnect with the people around you and realize that your life has meaning even as everything is ending. It was very beautiful. I was like, this is a gorgeous book.
Oh my gosh, that sounds fantastic. I just want to go back to your Twisters comment. The special effects were really good. So totally ignoring anything about the characters or the story or the plot. So I just like that. We're just gonna gloss over that one for right now. Just, it sounds like it's one of those leave your brain at the door type of movies.
Yes, I did say it, and then I said this sounds like the movie version of like you go to see a bad play, and then you go, "Wow, the lighting design was so good," or something like that. Where I'm like, it sounds like I'm saying this is a terrible movie, and I'm not really saying it's a terrible movie, but it is a little bit of a like this is fun movie, and like don't think too hard about other stuff.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Interesting reviews. Okay, so Ashlyn, let's talk a little bit about you and your background. Were you one of those types like you were always a writer as a kid, or you kind of discovered it later in life? I mean, how did you get into writing?
I think I was always a writer as a kid, but in different ways. That wasn't always the primary thing I was doing, but I was convinced I was going to be a novelist from very early on. I think I dictated a book to my mother. I was like, this is the best thing ever. And I had all these book ideas. I think I started trying to write when I was really little, and I think one of them I thought about recently, and I'm convinced it's an incredible idea, but I the execution was obviously horrible when I tried to write it when I was like 7 years old. But it was about this, it's very like dystopian young adult, but it was about this world where people were in a high school where everything they did got rated, and all of that like was like how they were perceived by other people and how good their grades were and like what they were doing all the time, and they were always seeming to be surveilled, and then all of that was input into a computer that would spit out like a popularity score for them. And then obviously the twist is that it turns out that they're in a computer simulation, which I think that that tells you where I started from.
So you were Black Mirror before Black Mirror was a thing.
It is very Black Mirror. I really was like, if I could have executed this really well, I think this would have been an incredible book. But obviously, it was just the concept, and I didn't even know how to write dialogue properly at that time period. So it's a little rough if you actually try to look at the thing, but the idea was great.
Fantastic. Okay, so you were a writer from a young age. So who were some of your influences or writers that you just like? Oh my gosh, so and so has a new book coming out. I've got to get in line to get it, or it's they've got it on order for me at the store.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I gotta say, I loved the series of Unfortunate Events books. Those were
Hmm.
so great. Which I think it's very classic for especially people of my age. I loved Maura Pierce and I loved Diane Wynne Jones. I really liked like Howl's Moving Castle, the Chrestomanci books. I was a very big fan of those books. And I was a really big fan of the Alana the Lioness series. I really liked A Girl with a Sword. That's what I wanted to be reading at the time. I think it's funny because sometimes I talk to other people and they're naming books that they loved in their childhood, and they're all like contemporary books about normal children. And all I wanted was people with magic. So I was like, wow, I really have been the same since the beginning.
Okay, that's great. I mean, you can't go wrong with a good girl with a sword story.
No, you can't. I love A Girl with a Sword.
Exactly. So, okay, so it sounds like magic and fantasy, big influences. So, is that kind of what led to you eventually writing? I'm going to go with you. This was a very strong theme of your first book, "How to Succeed in Witchcraft."
Yeah, I think that it's never been a question for me that I wanted to write in the speculative genre.
Hmm.
Everything I want to do is, and now that I'm an adult, I am more interested in sort of contemporary themes, which is why I ended up in contemporary fantasy. But everything I've ever wanted to do is like people with magic powers and like big themes about who you are in the world and having power and agency,
Hmm.
as told through people with magic.
Okay, so so like I said before we started, I have a ton of questions about your new book, "Spells to Forget Us." I also was as I was writing my notes, I was like trying to abbreviate, like, oh my God, the title. If you tighten it up, is this how you had it filed? STFU, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to mention that to you.
No, I did not realize that when, because this wasn't the original title of the book. We
Oh,
retitled it to be this. And when we retitled it, I had not abbreviated it in all of my drafts up to that point. So I didn't realize for a while until I was putting together a document to send to my editor. And then I started abbreviating it because that's what I do with the title documents. And I go, STFO.
fortunately, that's not the published title.
Yes, it is not. But I do get a little giggle out of referring to it in that in my
As you should,
title
as you
documents.
should.
Yeah.
So, just kind of give us like, what's the pitch for Spells to Forget Us? I mean, what was the inspiration for it, and like, what did you think? Oh, hey, what was that bolt from the blue that that kind of started things off?
Yeah, so the book is about a world where magic is secret. It's our world nowadays, but the big twist is, magical people are here and around us, but they're just living in secret. A witch and a non-magical girl fall for each other. According to magical law, in order for the witch to tell the non-magical girl about magic, she has to cast a spell that will erase the non-magical girl's memories about both magic and their relationship if they ever break up. But that memory spell goes wrong and they do break up, but they both end up forgetting each other instead of just the non magical girl forgetting. And then they meet again, fall for each other all over again, and recover their memories of the last time that they dated. So, as a result of this memory spell gone wrong, they get trapped in this cycle of meet cutes and breakups.
Yeah, I was gonna say I did because I was thinking, okay, it's not necessarily time travel, but there are a lot of time loops that I was trying to think like some kind of comparison, especially for me as a screenwriter. I was like, okay, it's very Groundhog Day esque that it's almost they're not reliving the same thing over and over again, but it's almost kind of sort of like the same experiences. Now, was that your intention when you started it, or did you just kind of think, okay, I've got a witch and a non-magic user, what can happen?
This is a very concept driven book. I
Hmm.
thought the concept of these people keep dating over and over because of some sort of magic. That was the premise I started from. It's funny that people compare it to Groundhog Day because that's my dad's favorite movie.
Oh.
And I have seen that movie a truly insane number of times. My father and I will like text each other quotes from the movie on Groundhog Day. Like that's how many times I've seen this movie.
Wow.
So I think it makes sense at the end of the day that I would end up making some art that was subliminally inspired by Groundhog Day. So yeah, I very much was like, here's the concept, and then I was trying to figure out how to design magic that would make that work. And I was trying to figure out how to tell that story in a way that didn't make the witch seem like a terrible person.
Mhm.
Because I think that in my original, very early drafts of this, I was like, okay, like she casts this spell on this girl and then she forgets about it, but then keeps trying to date her. And that quickly died because it was very hard to make it not seem like the worst story in the world about someone who just like keeps secretly trying to make something happen with someone who wanted to break up.
Mhm. Okay. I do want to ask this because I'm sure you've probably heard this one before a lot. Uh, how hard is it to write a story that magic plays a huge role and not have people think about Harry Potter?
Yeah, I like to think that as time goes on, we kind of get farther away from that. I think that there's sort of no way of escaping it sometimes in the young adult market specifically,
Hmm.
especially if you're writing magical school novels, you do get compared to Harry Potter a lot. Um, but especially writing queer young adult novels, I feel sometimes that I'm like, well, we're just doing our own thing, and that's obviously a titan in the genre. But also sometimes our fans are different people, and especially as young people nowadays didn't grow up with it the same way.
Hmm.
When I was a kid, it was a big thing. It was like an event. People were going to launches and stuff like that. But nowadays, it's like this juggernaut, but there's not people having it come out and be such an event the same way.
Sure, sure.
So I feel like maybe we're moving in a slightly different direction where things it's great to have lots of people who maybe found that as their introduction to the genre, but I'm very excited to have other people discovering newer works and more diverse works as as time goes on.
Yeah, and I was also thinking that because that was my first thought when I started the book, but as I read it, I was thinking, okay, Harry Potter is really geared towards a much younger, let's be honest, a more chaste audience. Like, oh my God, they're gonna kiss. And but in yours, it not that things get hot and heavy, but there's a little more about the emotional aspect of relationships and how the magic factors into it. And I think you did a really good job of setting it apart because in screenwriting we call it familiar but different. So it's kind of like it's a story with magical elements and themes, but this one is I was really impressed with that. It's really about the relationship between these two characters, and that's one of the things that I thought you did a fantastic job with was like that you go back and forth. That there's no main character. It's like co-main characters, and each chapter, but not that it's automatically back and forth, but you may have like two chapters about Luna the witch, or one chapter. I hope it's Aoife. I hope I'm saying that right. Okay.
Yes.
And was that something that you wanted to do? Was kind of like, okay, I'm going to tell it from her perspective first, and then the next chapter, the other character's perspective.
Yeah, that's one of the things that excited me about this book the most. Honestly, I'm a big fan of romance actually. I read a lot of adult romance books. That's like one of my favorite things. Especially it's nice, I think personally as an author to read in a genre and a category that you don't write in. Because then you're not thinking like so much like business and like the industry. It's like nice to just enjoy something. But I think the reason that I'm always so drawn to that is because I am fascinated by like character portrait and the way that romance is able to hold a mirror up to who people are, and either sort of like the best parts of themselves, especially when you get to see that other perspective and see someone who's falling in love with someone, like the way that they see another person can be so wonderful, and it's like much of a mirror to their best qualities, but then also like where the friction is in romance is often what their fatal flaw is, and that's the thing that they kind of need to overcome or move through to try and find love and like find connection with other people. So that's why I was really excited about this like dual point of view thing. This is the first book I've ever written with two points of view, and I had so much fun doing this, especially because there's a lot of the conflict in this book. A lot of the conflict in this book is that the two of them are not on the same page, right? It's
Mhm.
that the two of them have different amounts of information that they know about different things, or are like not being totally forthcoming with what is happening in their life, are like trying to constantly navigate how much they want to let this person that they're falling for into what's going on with them. And it's nice also, they're also teens, and a lot of this is inspired by a lot of my like romantic life for obviously like a decade, like
Mhm.
for much of my teens and early 20s, uh, and the ways that it can be a time period where people are like tremendously insecure and also are not necessarily always in control of their own choices, because they live at home, right? And so they're not necessarily fully I don't know, fully realized people
Sure.
in the way that they will be when they are like living in their own apartment and choosing what they're doing with their life completely on their own. So I think that that is what was so exciting about this to me, is about having these two people like looking at each other and having one of them be like, this is what Aoife's like, this is what I think that Luna is feeling right now. And then you get it flipping to Luna, and Luna's like, I'm actually self-conscious about this totally different thing that Aoife doesn't know I'm thinking about at all. And I think that that's what the fun of it was for me.
Oh, I totally get that, and that was really prevalent throughout the whole thing. Is that we're getting to read slash hear this inner. I wasn't. It's not a monologue. It's like an inner, thoughts type of thing,
Mhm.
and that both of them that we hear everything from. I wrote it from emotions to relationships, just kind of like how they're viewing things. It's really getting a seat inside their head and hearing exactly what's going on. And one of the things that I thought was also really impressive is that you establish each of their personalities from the start. That there's no growing into it. It's like they from the beginning we get a really strong sense of how each character is. So you're saying that you kind of based it, or you used elements of your own story. That I was curious, like, so these two characters, especially, are they based on people you know? Are they both like one specific aspect of your personality, or it's just kind of like, I've never written someone who's like, really full of self doubt, and so I'm going to try that.
I will say, I think Luna is one of my favorite characters because she's one of the first main characters I've written where I'm like, this girl is nothing like me. I like the things about her that are not similar to me. I am deeply uncomfortable with confrontation, and so I really was excited to write a character who is much more confrontational, who is not necessarily trying to please people all the time. I loved that. That's one of my favorite things to do. I find like grumpy characters in books so charming, especially I just love that about her. I'm not particularly introverted either, and she's a really an introvert pretty essentially. So that character is truly nothing like me. I think I just made her up out of my head, and I really just enjoyed that. Aoife is a lot more similar to me. A lot of things that I was trying to talk about thematically in her story are things that were more like personal to me, especially in terms of like identity and trying to move through like being mixed race and how people perceive you versus your own self perception of yourself, and how those two things can be different. And you don't necessarily need to be like, well, everybody thinks about me like this, and that must be who I am. So that was the stuff that I was trying, that I think is more similar to me. Uh, and also the stuff I really related to, the stuff about, with her, about trying to always take care of other people's feelings and always be very accommodating to others and wanting other people to be happy so much that sometimes it undercuts your own desires in life. But I think that they're also, their actual relationship is really not based on anything specific that I have gone through in my life. I was very intentional about being like, this is inspired by themes from things I've experienced, but nothing. I don't want anyone that I've ever dated in my life to be able to look at a book that I've written and be able to be like, that's me, because I think that I honestly I find that kind of rude to do that to someone, so I would not want to do that.
Well, I found that people who read a character not knowing that it's actually based on them don't recognize that it's them. So they'll be like,
That's
"Oh my God,
true.
this character you created, what a jerk! Oh my God, how'd you ever come up with that?" It's like, I don't know, just just being creative. One of the things I also really like, that this relationship between Luna and Aoife, that you show all the positives and the negatives. There are good times and a lot of bad times. Were there things that you made a point of wanting to include? Like, did you have a list of like, okay, these are the things that they have to go through, or some of the experiences that they have to share? And were there any things that you just kind of suddenly, oh, hey, this would be a great idea, and you were able to like figure a way to put that in?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of the second where there were things where when I was actually getting to scenes, my outlining is both specific and vague. I write
Sure.
like bad thing happens here. So so it maybe just vague. But there it were outlines where I was like, this is where they are not together. This is where they are together, and that was outlined. And I had general ideas for things that could be like schisms in their relationship. So those were pretty specific. But then I did have stuff where in my outline it was just like a nice scene between the two of them was all I had written down. And then I sort of saw what had led up to that point and thought about who these people were and what sides of them we wanted to try and additionally see, and like seed that into that kind of scene. So I think there were a lot of things that I discovered as I went along. Um, I think in revising, stuff that I added that I really liked was the feeling of being really obsessed with someone as a teenager. Because I definitely people that I fell for when I was a teenager. I could have just never spoken to anyone else. I was like, all I want to do is sit in a room and talk to you. This is the best. You're the best part of my whole life. I don't need food, like water, sleep. Who needs it? And I think that that was some of the stuff that I was able to like put in, like in I think especially the midpoint of the book, where there's some stuff that's like, I think from Aoife's point of view, where it's like, it's kind of a problem how obsessed I am with her.
Mm.
Like all I want to do is spend time with her. And that was definitely something that I find as both a big positive and sometimes a negative for being a teenager and having really, really big feelings and being really obsessed with someone that you are falling for.
Sure, sure. And I thought one of the really more interesting aspects of it for me was that it's not just about the relationship between these two characters and their immediate, I guess, their immediate worlds, is that each of them has a very thorough and developed overall picture. Like with Aoife, it's about her family, the parenting blog and her little brother and some of her friends. And with Luna, it's about this whole almost like this political situation in the world of witches. And I just thought that was really clever how that, they each have their own problems apart from all the things they're going through with this relationship. So were those part of the initial concept, or were those did they develop as you were working on the story?
I think those were a part of my initial outlines for what this story would be, because when I was trying to think of the ways to fill in the concept, right? Of people who could have some reason to keep breaking up. I really thought I want people to root for these people. Like I want them to be together. So it does have to kind of be a star-crossed lovers thing. I don't want it to
Mhm.
be like they're just terrible and that's why they're just mean to each other and that's why it's not working out. That could be like you can usually justify like maybe one breakup where it's like someone says a mean thing, right? And then they don't, and then they're not together. But I don't necessarily want them to be like incredibly toxic in a way that you don't understand both of them. So I think that's why I gave them these like big lives, that they had reasons, that they you would always understand why they were doing something that was a bad idea. And you would want them to stop doing that, but also be like, if I was in that situation, I wouldn't stop either. And then also be sitting there being like, oh, also the situation around them is also actively like pulling them from each other. Because that's, I think I mentioned this a little earlier, like that's to me is so much the crux of dating someone when you're, 17, is that they still live generally with their parents or their family, and that's still so much impacting the way they're able to interact with you. And so that's when I was trying to write this kind of star-crossed lovers story. I was like, the families are the problem. Like the people around them are creating the situation where they aren't able to, come together and have the kind of relationship that they necessarily want to have.
Okay. You kind of touched on this a little earlier that like you were, I guess, going through or testing some potential main story ideas, and like the one where Luna keeps casting the spell, and you rejected that one. So I am curious, like as you were developing and outlining the story, did you come up with something and then find, oh my God, this is not working, and then you'd have to cut it, or like, oh, okay, instead of it going this way, instead of going right, I'll turn left, and then all of a sudden that has this widespread ramifications throughout the rest of the story. So I guess the thing is, like, how was it tough to map out the story? Or were you able to just kind of like, okay, I know how to get from point A to point G, but now it's just like avoiding that zigzag between A and G.
Yes, I think outlining this book was hard. I I don't, some of this is a little spoilery, so I can't
Oh,
necessarily
okay.
talk too
What
much
I was
about
going to say, whatever you're comfortable with saying.
yes, yeah. I I will say that the original draft of it was very like linear, and it was not so it became more complicated in
Mm.
revising it actually. Um and that was ultimately good, but I sort of had initially thought that it would be the way it ended up being at the end. And then I went, that's too hard. And I didn't write it that way. And then my editor gave me a note that was like, maybe you could do this other thing. And I went, oh, that idea I rejected because it was too hard. um, and I guess that's all I'll say about that. But I also think that I am an overly ambitious, perhaps, plotter. I always have at least kind of two large elements that don't make it to the end, which seems hard, or like seems ridiculous because my books are complicated enough. There's enough going on in them. So there was this whole extra plot that I had in some early drafts and and outlines where Aoife had way more friends in early
Oh,
drafts. Yes,
wow.
because I was excited about and I'll be excited about this in some other book, but I was excited about having a main character with lots of friends. Because I oh, what did I read? I think I read Ophelia After All, which is a young adult contemporary, which is amazing because I just was really struck by Ophelia as the main character. She had so many friends. I was like, this is amazing. Like all these people feel real. There's so many of them. I also felt like it felt more realistic because a lot of teens actually do have lots of friends and they have large friend groups. And then I started trying to write that, and there were just 4 or 5 people I had to be moving around, and they're obviously not like the crux of the plot necessarily, is
Mhm.
the friends that the Aoife has at school. So those had to go. I had to simplify the plot. So now she has like 2 friends. And the sort of idea that she has more friends in the background, but these are her main friends. Because that was too many things to try and be doing in a book that, also has like witches and a whole magical world and a girlfriend with a complicated political family situation.
I was gonna say, when you have so many characters, you have to find something for all of them to do. And then when you have too many characters, you're like, you can't have them just standing around like, yeah, you're right, Aoife.
Yeah, I find that that's so hard with side characters, is that you want them to seem like they have their own lives, but also you're literally don't have the space to show that whole life. So it's kind of having them show up and be like, my thing is happening too, every so often, and then they kind of run off into the background, and you're like, guys, I hope my readers feel like that person's a real person. This is also like the D plot, that they're having anything else happening with them. Yeah, so Aoife originally had this friendship breakup that was like a crux of the plot for her. It was a She had like a third thing that was happening. It was like her family and the stuff with her male friend, and then the stuff with these other female friends that she had, and that had to go.
Okay.
Yeah.
One of the things I wanted to, before we get on to writing in this kind of genre, that I've had guests on before who write stories and their works, that the location where the story takes place almost plays a character. Like a couple of weeks ago, I talked to a writer based in Philadelphia, and her story was set in Philadelphia. And I'm from around that area, so I knew a lot of the locations of which she was writing. And your story takes place in Boston, and there's a lot of references, Harvard and Cambridge, and here's this like town that's like a suburb to the west or something like that. I kind of remember that. So, how important was it for you that the story was set in Boston? Which just kind of like, I know you live in Boston, but was it kind of like, okay, I'm going to write this story, and it's going to be about teenagers and witches, and it's going to be right here in Boston because I know this area.
This is really important to me actually about writing this. During the time I wrote this book, the early drafts of it, I wasn't living in Boston actually. I had left, and my spouse and I had moved to Georgia for a while. And this was during the pandemic that we
Uh,
moved to Georgia. And perhaps you can imagine, the pandemic is not exactly the best time to meet new people and become acclimated to a new area. And actually, we've left there not too long after things started opening up. So it really didn't feel like we ever lived there. So also, I felt like I was quarantining in a place where I didn't have any connections really.
mm,
So when I was writing this book, I was feeling a lot of longing for Boston and wanting to be in this place that really felt like home to me, but not being there, and that was why I ended up setting it there. Also, I had consumed a lot of media at that time period that was like magical New York books and stories, because people love to mythologize New York. And no hate to people who mythologize New York. I've been there quite a lot of times in my life. It's a wonderful city, but it is the city of the U.S. with the single greatest PR campaign, and I didn't need to do that for New York. And so I was like, you know what? I'd love to do that for a city that I like, feel is very near and dear to my heart. So I wanted to write a book in Boston. Also because I'm just like chronically quite bad in early drafts at describing location. Setting is like not my strongest suit. So I was like, we're gonna try a new thing here, and we're gonna make this be really important and try and describe things and really go in on that stuff. Because I usually have 1 or 2 things per book that are things that I'm trying to stretch myself and try and grow as a writer. So that was part of why I tried to pick that as well.
Okay, yeah, I was kind of like mentally keeping track. I know there's one mention of the Celtics. I want to say there's like one mention of Duncan. So
Right.
shockingly, not one Red Sox reference. I could not get over that.
It's because I don't care about sports.
Okay.
fundamentally, I don't care about sports. I actually have much more interactions on the day to day that are about the Red Sox in the
Hmm.
last few months, because I got a new job and now I'm a historical tour guide in near like downtown Boston. So now I interact with a lot of people who are coming into town, who are tourists coming to see games. And it's funny because I was like, oh, yeah, I forget people really care about this in this city because I don't care about this. But I really respect that. I love people being really passionate about their interests and hobbies. So I enjoy being exposed to people who care about it a lot. But it's more just that I don't love sports. And also, nobody that I know really loves specifically like men's baseball is not their vibe. So that's why there's not a Red Sox
Okay.
reference in
I'm
there.
not, it wasn't a complaint. It was just more like, that's just so surprising. It's
I think it is surprising too because I do think it is a big part of here, but it's just not a big part of my version of here, so that's why yeah, it didn't end up being in there. I did have them talk about basketball. That was also really a stretch for me. I had to do a lot of like Googling. Did more research on that single 3 lines about playing
wow.
basketball than anything else.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so one of the things I really wanted to ask you about is that I am always fascinated and intimidated about the idea of writing a YA story. So, I mean, you already said you were a big fan of the genre while you were growing up, and so, and that's what your other book was about as well. So, it doesn't sound like it was that challenging, but as you know, as a not teenager or not a YA person per se, like how challenging is it for you to write a contemporary YA story?
I I think that for a while, I wrote a lot of plays. So I think voice is not always the hardest thing for me. Tend to, people read my stuff and say that the voice is usually a strong suit of what I'm writing. So I have always enjoyed that. Um, and yeah, that's been one of the things that I've enjoyed a lot of writing first person young adult. I will say some of the challenges of writing young adult is so logistical. And it's just because I'm writing contemporary fantasy is that, they have to do all these things because they're minors. They have to like go to school and like have sketch. So I'm always like Googling the school schedules and being like, oh no, like I can't say that this happened a week later because that's Thanksgiving break and they can't
Oh,
be in school. So it's like that kind of sort of nitty gritty stuff is actually hard. Or like thinking about like logistically getting my teenagers to go and hang out with people and figuring out like that they're in school this time period, and if the people who are they're interacting with don't go to the same school as them, they can't be hanging out at like 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. So I think that that's kind of some of the logistical issues of writing young adult contemporary fantasy. And I am excited at some point to write some, more high fantasy stuff where I could just be like, they're just thieves on the street or something like that, because you don't have to think about the school schedule and be like Googling like Cambridge Public Schools school schedule to make sure that your people can actually be doing the thing that they're supposed to be doing. I think those logistical problems are actually the things that I would point to as being some of the most difficult. Because you want your people to be like going on adventures and having cool stuff happen to them. But if they're not living in XYZ fantasy world where that can be happening, it can be harder to get them there and be
of
like,
course.
I got that's why all the parents are dead. That's why people make jokes about all the parents being dead in young adult, because it's a heck of a lot easier to get your teen protagonists to be like out slaying dragons if their parents are dead. Because if I was a parent to a teen, I wouldn't want them to be going to slay a dragon. I would be like, if that has to happen, I'll do it. Like, what do you mean you're the chosen one? Don't do that.
Oh, that's right. I've talked to other writers who do write YA, and some of them are parents, and so their kids are in that target demographic. So, is that something that you used while you were putting the story together? Like, did you have friends with teenagers, and like you would ask them questions like, okay, like, was this how this would go, or do you have to ask them like, and now tell me again, like how you about interacting with people on Instagram or Snapchat or or whatever the whatever the current app of choice is.
Yeah, I think that I realized that I am much closer to teenagerdom. So I can still kind of reference things that I was doing not like incredibly long ago. And as I get older, I feel more and more that I'm like, I'm not going to be able to rely on just like what I did anymore, or like what I am doing on the internet. And I'm like, oh, I see teens in kind of the same internet soup as me, even though we're not interacting directly. So I know
Mhm.
they're not like too far away from what I was doing at that time period. But I do think that as I age, that will become less and less true as time goes on. But I think that that has been a boon for me, especially because I started writing young adult when I was, well, I started writing when I was a teen, and then I took a gap, and then I started writing again when I was like 22, 23. Or yeah, I think I was 22. So I had been a teen not incredibly long before that point. So I'm still coasting on that to some
Mhm.
extent. But I think eventually I'll have to start asking people about their teens. But it was nice. Every so often, I would like go and hang out with some, teens in my extended family, and I would be like, "All right, it's the same."
Yeah, I was going to say that a big part of the book is that Luna and Aoife, they're texting to each other. So there's a ton of text messages and the occasional use of emojis. So it's kind of like, okay, I think that, and also the fact that Aoife's parents, their business is running this parenting blog. It just felt very modern and very contemporary. It felt like this could actually be happening right now because they're talking about using their phones and they're texting each other and they're calling each other on the sly type of thing. And I just thought that it was a really smart approach to it, that not that it would necessarily feel dated very soon, but just kind of felt like of the time. And I thought that was a really, and I guess a really smart move on your part to just incorporate that into the story.
I'm glad. Yeah, there was definitely some part of me because you write these books like 2 years before they actually come out, right? So there was some part of me that was like, I hope TikTok doesn't die before this book comes out, and then everyone goes, "This is
MySpace, what's that?
exactly." Because I was like, "Oh no," because that like this technology and the internet moves so quickly that I even look at things that I was doing like a year and a half ago, and I'm like, "Wow, that app doesn't exist anymore," and stuff like that. So I always am somewhat cautious about things that I'm putting in there. And I also am really cautious about slang as well,
Mm,
because some slang endures and other slang dies. And I don't want to put in slang that is very of like 2022 and then
sure.
have the book come out in 2024 and be like, I don't know why people be like, why are you having these people say skibbity toilet? Like only middle schoolers say that now. And I'm like, God. So I'm always like very like I don't know, circumspect when it comes to that stuff.
Mhm.
And my editor is like that as well, especially about like references to like music and things like
Mm.
that. You have to be really specific about being like, is this realistically a thing that people are still going to be talking about in 2 years? Is this going to feel dated? Is that going to feel dated? And thankfully, I haven't had anybody, I don't know, DM me on Instagram being like, this is embarrassing. And everybody don't at me if you read something in my book and go, that feels like it happened 2 years ago, because that's when I wrote
I
it.
was
So
gonna say that's when it happened. Ashley, I want to ask you. So we like to ask our writers who come on what advice they would give to other writers, especially writers who are trying to do the same kind of thing that you've written. You're writing fantasy, writing YA, writing contemporary YA fantasy. I mean, so if what would be some key pieces of advice or suggestions that you would give to writers?
I feel like one of the biggest pieces of advice I would give right now, particularly because this is advice I would give myself, is
Mhm.
to figure out whatever you can do to instill confidence in yourself. Because just working in art generally is full of a lot of setbacks and a lot of, people telling you that yes, this is great, but we can't represent you. We can't sell this. We can't do blah, blah, blah. And that's because, there's so many people trying to make it in art in any given moment. And so I feel like in these career fields with so much rejection, it's like important to try and figure out what you can do for yourself that will remind you that you like your own work and that you feel confident in it, and that's why you're sending it out to people, and that's why you're trying to get people to read it, and you're trying to touch other people and like change their lives however much they can be changed with your thing. So I think that the ways that people can feel confident about themselves really vary. So I can't give you like a specific, here's how you feel confident about yourself. Like go
Sure.
talk to the mirror every day and say affirmations. I always feel particularly stupid doing affirmations. That's not for me. But
Okay.
I think that there's some things that I can do when I can read back my stuff and be like that, like when I read stuff that I've done where I'm like, that's like more or less finished. I really enjoy reading my own jokes, honestly. I know that that feels embarrassing just to admit on a podcast, but I think I'm funny because, my sense of humor is perfectly aligned with, in fact, my own sense of humor. So it's nice to read my own stuff and be like, this was pretty good. I really liked that. And that's like sometimes a confidence boost that can get me through, another few days of or something happening that's not necessarily so affirming. To be able to like go back to my own like lodestar and be like, well, the reason I do this is because like I think it's good, even if it's not everybody's cup of tea, it's mine. And I think that that can be different for different people, but to try and notice when something is like a confidence builder. I know some people are like have their little like confidence folder on their computer that's like positive reviews that they've gotten that were really
Mm.
meaningful, or like contact with people from who read their book and really liked it and sent them a DM that they like screenshot it and put it in that folder so that when they feel like really downtrodden, they can look at it. Or like even if the person reading it is just like your mom's and you're like, wow, my mom sent me a nice email about this, and you could screenshot it and put it in your little confidence folder so that when you look at it later, when people are like, well, hey, I we have a lot of people submitting right now. It's not we can't take you, but thank you so much for submitting. You could be like, wow, that feels terrible. And then you could open up your little confidence folder and go, but my mom thinks my book is great.
That's always important. And I find what's really it's surprising is that you go back and read something that you don't remember writing. And then you're like, wow, this is actually pretty good.
Yeah, that's why I like things that you have enough distance from. Because when you're editing something still, you're like, God, this feels terrible and it's never going to work. And I use the word just too many times or whatever. But when I go back and read something that I wrote like 3 years ago, sometimes I look at it and I go, didn't remember I did this. I'm like, this is very charming. Or like, oh, this like bit that I remember that I wanted it to come off this way. And it really does. And I'm enjoying that about it. And I think that that is really magical. And sometimes it's difficult to capture because you don't always forget your stuff quickly enough to do it, but it's nice to do that every so often.
Okay, well, the book is called Spells to Forget Us, and the writer, our guest today, has been Aislinn Brophy. Aislinn, where can people find you online? Do you have a website or are you on any of these social media platforms?
I am. So my website is ashlandbrophy.com. And then I'm on Instagram and TikTok as at Aislinn Brophy author.
Okay, and the book, I believe, comes out very, very soon. Right now, we're recording this near the end of August, but I believe the book comes out mid-September-ish. So
Yep.
look for it. Here's a picture of it. And if you're listening to this, it's purple and it's got magical stuff on the cover. And again, it's called Spells to Forget Us by Aislinn Brophy. Aislinn, thank you so much for being here today. This was a wonderful conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. And audience, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please feel free to hit like and subscribe, leave a comment, tell your friends. You can always use the followers. You can check out my screenwriting blog, Maximum Z, at maximumz.blog. I'm on Twitter at maximum_Z. And this show has its own Twitter account as well at podcast CWL. And I'm also on Instagram. That is at Pez Screenwriting. Yes, because are my initials. Also, you can check out my Go Ahead and Ask books on Amazon, the books about screenwriting and pie, two very wonderful things. Like I said, that is Aislinn. I'm Paul. This has been the Creative Writing Life podcast. Thanks for listening. Stay safe, stay healthy, and most importantly, go write something.